We are very pleased to work with Abe Denmark and his team in the Asia program to bring this 2 days of programming to you. The previous session asked the question of whether China has an authoritarian or China model that it is trying to export internationally. This session is somewhat related to that issue. Our title is Global Norms, Governance, and Chinese Policymaking. And there is an ongoing debate in the United States and around the world about what China's intentions are regarding the established global system, if we can speak of such a thing in these times. Does China, as it has claimed repeatedly, merely intend to refine and indeed improve the existing frameworks? Or, as some of China's critics have said, is China in fact a revisionist state that wants to overthrow that? We got into this a little bit in the previous panel. And the question came up of whether perhaps China is seeking merely to make the world more amenable to a communist party that is increasingly repressive at home and aggressive abroad. Is China seeking to legitimize its illiberal domestic practices and values internationally? Or is it seeking to dominate the system? We're not going to go into the 30,000-foot high version of that question. In this session, we're going to look at specific cases with two of our scholars. The first will be Xiao Liu, who is assistant professor at McGill University and a fellow at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution of the World Economic Forum. Her research focuses on the social and cultural history of information technology and digital media in contemporary China. Her work has been sponsored by the American Council of Learned Societies and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. She is currently co-editing a special issue of the journal Interventions, International Journal of Post-Colonial Studies, doing work there on inter-Asian infrastructures. She will speak to us first on understanding China's governance of personal data. I will then introduce our second speaker right before she speaks. I did want to remind everybody that if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to us at any time, either by tagging @Asia Program on Twitter, or by sending an email to asia@wilsoncenter.org. And that's Wilson Center, one word, asia@wilsoncenter.org. We look forward to hearing from you and bringing all of you into this discussion. With that, Xiao Liu, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks, Robert, for the really generous introduction, and also thanks to Wilson Center for organizing this. It's a great pleasure to be here and share with you my report on the governance space around personal data in China. In October 2020, China's highly anticipated Personal Information Protection Law was released for public comments, along with cybersecurity law implemented in 2017 and data security law, a draft of which was also released for public comments in July 2020. The issue of Personal Information Protection Law, or PIPL, is regarded as a major milestone on China's legislative path to establish a comprehensive set of regulations on data. Commentators and data policy professionals quickly noticed that many provisions of the draft PIPL resembles the European Union's GDPR and other major data legislations in other jurisdictions. So in this project, I studied China's governance space around personal data. I used the term data governance here to differentiate from data regulation. While data regulation is state-centered, data governance emphasizes the multiplicity and interactions of actors and the mechanism, as well as the competition and the negotiation between a variety of roles and interests. I also want to mention here why much attention has been drawn to extraterritorial application of China's data regulation and the aspect of cross-border data flows. Here, I want to focus exclusively on internal driving forces for data protection, as well as practical challenges in personal data protection, which has been little discussed so far. I hope this will provide more concrete and fuller pictures of China's data governance scenario. So let me start with sharing some of the key findings here. First, personal data protection is an integral part of China's data strategy, and the unveiling of PIPL is part of China's regulatory moves in recent years to establish the legal foundations for data governance. And second, in contrast to the common perception and popular discourse that there's no personal information protection in China, or Chinese people care little about privacy, personal information protection has already become a hyperactive field in China, which is continuously energized not only by national legislation and policymaking, but more important, by the participation of legal professionals and common citizens, as well as immense media attention and active public discourses. Third, China's data policy professionals and new generations legal professionals have been following closely the global trends of data governance and taking conscious actions to advance personal information protection. And common Chinese citizens have also expressed a strong interest in this field. And then finally, a study of several recent lawsuits reveals that China's data protection is faced with many similar challenges shared elsewhere, particularly in defining the proper boundary of personal information and privacy, and balancing individual rights with public interests and industrial developments. So let me elaborate on each of these points here in detail. Many of the audiences here may be familiar with the discussion of China's national big data strategy. In 2017, President Xi Jinping declared that China needs to promote the deepened integration of internet, big data, and artificial intelligence with the real economy. Also, in recognition of the role of data in economy, the CCP leadership in 2019 listed data as one of the factors of production, along with land, labor, capital, and technology. So in addition to institutional and financial investments in information infrastructure, big data research, and innovation, data governance also constitutes an essential component of this big data strategy. Xi himself, in fact, stressed several times the urgence to research on global conventions and norms on data regulations. So what do you see here? The drafting of PIPL, I want to mention the draft of PIPL actually started as early as 2003 under the directorship of the then State Council Information Office. Yet even before the unveiling of the PIPL, Chinese government had already issued a variety of laws and regulations, guidelines to address the issues of personal data protection in different realms, which really laid the foundation for the unveiling of PIPL. So I listed some of the examples here of the regulations and laws in specific sectors that has included or contains certain elements or certain kind of provisions on the protection of personal information. So the main point here is that given the pivotal role of data in national and regional economy, data protection is regarded as crucial to both economic vitality and governance soundness. It is integral to China's data strategy. But instead of concentrating on state regulation, here I want to foreground the social space around data governance. This is because if we just focus on legislative moves of the central government, we would risk reducing the really complicated set of issues that concern the interest of a broad range of social actors into merely the outcome of the imagined monolithic state power. So by shifting to the social space around data governance, I want to provide a fuller picture that reveals the negotiation and contest of different social agents and actors active in this space. So in many ways, these actions and expression of interest are interconnected with the state policy and legislation in the sense that they often constitute feedback loops to amplify the urgency of data protection in media and public discourse. The emergence of this hyperactive space can be traced back to the tragic death of a teenage girl named Xu Yuyu in 2016. The 18-year-old girl died of a heart attack after falling victim to a telephone scam and being swindled out of 9,900 yuan, which was the fund her family raised for her college tuition. So the girl's death ignited a vocal expression of frustration and anger over rampant leaking and illegal trading of personal information, as netizens started to question where and how the scammers had acquired detailed personal information of the girl to make her a target victim. Salem Metropolis Daily, which is a newspaper based in Guangzhou, even made a comment that there should be an Xu Act in order to address the lack of specific legislation and the weak law enforcement over personal information protection. Indeed, the Xu case created a hyperactive space with intensive media coverage, social media discourses, and active engagements of legal professionals and common citizens, as well as a reaction from different levels of government agencies, all of which make personal information protection a social concern of high visibility. Through Chinese social media such as Xinlang Weibo and WeChat public accounts, data rights groups have been active in translating and disseminating information of recent data protection policies and trends around the world, and organizing offline salons and workshops with participants from both public and private sectors, as well as civil society organizations. For example, the Personal Information Protection Research Center of the Salem Metropolis Daily has been publishing yearly reports on the state of personal information security in China. The center has also conducted a series of in-depth investigation into public concerned issues such as facial recognition, such as privacy setting of the mobile phone apps. So in response to these public outcries, relevant government departments had launched multiple targeted campaigns against the illegal collection and trading of personal data. As researchers have pointed out in other contexts, campaign style enforcement is a common strategy for Chinese government and party officials to respond to publicly perceived crises, such as environment, such as issues in environment and public health. The targeted campaign enables extraordinary mobilization of administrative resources to achieve a specific policy target within a defined period of time. The point here is that we can see how the state actors reacted to the actions of non-state actors in public discourses, which also in turn enhances the media visibility of data protection issues. Another indicator of this hyperactive space is a case treated by media as the first lawsuit against the facial recognition. In October 2019, Guo Bing, a professor of the Zhejiang Sci-Tech University, sued Hangzhou Safari Park for the use of facial recognition at the park entry. What happened is that Guo, as an annual pass holder of the park, received a message informing him that the park entry authentication system has been upgraded to a facial recognition system, and the former system based on fingerprint has been retired. So unhappy with the facial recognition-based entry system and unable to reach an agreement with the park, Guo brought the case to the court. The case immediately received extensive attention and generated a heated discussion. I won't go into too much details here, but just wanted to mention that Guo had also previously sued Apple for its payment services, but eventually dropped the case because of the difficulty of battling such a big tech company. Already see as a spokesperson for the public discussion or public discontent with the prevalence of facial recognition, Guo mentioned in media interviews that although a lawsuit against personal information violation could be burdensome to individual consumers, it was his goal that the lawsuit could provide practical learnings to establish more effective legal rules and practice for the protection of personal information. So this case is representative of a recent trend in China's data governance space, where legal professionals and informed citizens took conscious actions and leveraged legal tools to express their interests and opinions publicly. In September 2020, another law professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing also decided to sue her homeowners association for installing a facial recognition system at the community center, at the community entry. So these are really highly visible cases that involves facial recognition. But besides these highly visible cases, there are two other cases brought by individual consumers against the big companies, are particularly worth mentioning here. In the Lin versus Douyin and Doushan case, the plaintiff named Lin, when registering for the two social apps, was prompted with a list of people who you might know on the apps. Suspecting that the app has already read his phone contacts list without consent, he sued the company backdowns for violating his personal information and privacy. And in the Huang versus Tencent case, the plaintiff, Mrs. Huang, using the app WeChat Reading, found that her reading information was already shared with her contacts on WeChat app without her knowledge. She therefore sued the parent company of the two apps. So in both cases here, as in the two other cases we mentioned before about facial recognition, the plaintiffs are individuals with good knowledge of legal statutes and institutions, or with strong legal assistance to litigate the case. For example, Lin in the first case is a PhD student in law, and while Huang in the second case is reported to be a staff member at law firm. So these well-informed plaintiffs are familiar with both existing personal data protection policies in China and also with GDPR and other data protection conventions around the world. So even in the absence of the PIL, because at this point the PIPL hasn't officially passed and it isn't effective yet. So the court statement and requests of these cases reflect their conscious leverage of their knowledge in this realm. It is also worth mentioning here that this kind of litigations have been encouraged among law school students by the universities and the professors as part of their education to gain practical experiences in law, and litigating against the big companies and organizations for their personal information and the privacy policy has become common among the new generation of legal professionals. Finally, a close study of these lawsuits and the written judgments by the court shows that the governance of personal data is in fact very complicated, involving the competition and the delicate balancing of different interests. Oops. China's data protection is fascinating. China's data protection is faced with many similar challenges shared elsewhere. For example, one prominent issue is the proper boundary of personal information and privacy. Although the PIPL's definition of personal information resembles GDPR's definition of personally identifiable information, or PII, referring to the type of data that are related to an identified or identifiable natural person. Yet in practice, because of big data analysis and the involvement of technology, the boundary of PII is always fuzzy and shifting. Another issue exposed in these cases is the inadequacy of the broad consent mechanism in data protection, which the Chinese court had handled flexibly in cases according to in the cases according to the concrete situations. So without going too much details here, these issues arising from China's cases exposes that the limits and inadequacy of existing paradigm of data regulation that relies on individualized or individual-centered mode of self-management. While this mode is predicated on individual deliberation of costs and benefits in the form of consent, in reality, with the increasingly complicated ecosystem of data protection data uses, it is virtually impossible for any individual to make sound judgment or even understand the use of their personal information. In addition, the imbalanced power between individuals and big companies and organizations that have more financial and legal resources also make it a kind of burden for individuals to defend their rights. This has become increasingly recognized by global data policy researchers with ongoing discussion on the means to address the limits of self-management mode of privacy protection. So these examples from China provide further lessons to rethink the current approach to data regulation. I want to end with a brief summary of the policy implications here. First, both Chinese state and non-Chinese state actors are strongly motivated to develop strategies and policies for personal data protection. The second, the data protection concerns the interests of a broad range of social actors, agents, and this will require a multi-stakeholder approach to actively involve a variety of actors in the governance space of data. And then finally, it is increasingly recognized that a diversity of strategies and approaches are needed to complement the self-management mode of data protection in order to effectively protect privacy and serve public interests under the conditions of big data. I will stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Xiao Liu. You've given us an awful lot to think about, and obviously a great many parallels between what China faces and what we face here in the United States, this rapidly evolving set of issues. We will now hear from Wendy Leutert, who is the GLP Mingzi Mei Chair of Chinese Economics and Trade at Indiana University's Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies and in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. Wendy, I hope you don't have to memorize all that in Chinese to introduce yourself at various conferences. That would be a bit of a mouthful. Her work focuses on the historical evolution and global expansion of China's state-owned enterprises, leadership in China's public sector, corporate governance in state-owned enterprises, and international investment and trade. You may have read her commentary on these issues in the Financial Times, the New York Times, Reuters, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the South China Morning Post. And she is going to speak to us now about the international origins of China's national champions. And before handing it over to Wendy again to ask a question, please either send an email to us at asia@wilsoncenter.org or by tagging @AsiaProgram on Twitter. We would like to hear from you. Wendy, please.
All right, hi everyone. I want to start by thanking you, Robert, for such a generous introduction and thanking everyone for coming to our panel today. I also want to thank the Wilson Center for organizing the China Fellows Program. It's really been a wonderful experience. And I'm very happy today to present some research that I've been developing during this fellowship titled Policy Collaging, Transnationalizing Analysis of Chinese Policymaking. And this is very much a work in progress, so I especially welcome any questions and comments that you might have during the Q&A. So I want to start my talk with this term, Chinese state-owned enterprises, or as you'll hear me refer to it in this talk, SOEs. So I'd like you at home in front of your computer screens to just close your eyes for 1 or 2 seconds and think about what comes to mind for you. When you see this term, what do you think of? So I'll give you just 1 or 2 seconds to play this mental game with me. All right, so for many of us, I think that the image that comes to mind when we hear this term Chinese state-owned enterprise, it might be something like this. So here we have a scene from the past. Here you can see an image of a state-owned factory in Chongqing from the 1960s. And we get the feeling that this is quite outdated. You might think of these firms as being just as much an element of the past as the Mao suits that you see some of the workers wearing, as outdated as the equipment that you see them using. But in fact, today, this type of an image would be a much more accurate representation of these Chinese state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, today. So this is an image that I took in the parking lot in Beijing outside a Chinese Central State-owned Enterprise office. And here we very much get the impression of these firms as being a modern multinational corporations. Judging by some of the cars in the parking lot here, it seems like the company is doing pretty well. And very different images compared to the past. So how then do we account for changes in China's enterprise policies and the state-owned enterprises that are associated with this transformation? And I think for many of us, we might initially think of this process as a purely domestic one. So we think of key actors within China. We think of this evolution and transformation as being the result of these domestic actors engaged in processes of experimentation and adaptation within China's borders. And so I certainly think that this is quite accurate. But what I'd like to do in my talk today is really call attention to the role of international policies and ideas, international policy ideas and practices in this specific realm of state-owned enterprises, and then beyond this area as well. And in this project, I analyze the role of these international policy ideas and practices using the concept of policy collaging. And I define this as a process of actively seeking out, selecting, and then creatively combining elements of policies from multiple international sources through transnational engagement. So if you're not familiar with what a collage is, here I include a picture on the right. Perhaps you, when you were a child, or maybe your own children, have done an art project like this. You take many small pieces of different things, you tear them up, and you put them together to create a new picture. And so this, I think, is a good representation of the type of process that I'm interested in looking at in this project. So what do I mean by transnational engagement? This sounds very vague. How do we understand this in more concrete terms? We can identify a number of different mechanisms through which this transnational engagement actually occurs. So I think most of us would be especially familiar with the first two on this list. So we know, of course, that transnational engagement occurs within the context of international organizations like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization. And we also, many of us, understand that it occurs in the context of transnational advocacy networks organized around a particular issue area and with its members united by a common cause, sharing information and ideas across national borders. But what I think we might be less familiar with are some of these other mechanisms that I look at in this project. So in the context of China, for example, there have been throughout the post-49 period in the People's Republic of China, international advisors. And so international advisors may actually have formal positions. So in the picture you see here on the right, this is an image of one of China's first international advisors in the reform era, Saburo Okita, visiting China in 1979. And he actually had this formal position of being an economic advisor to China's State Council until he became the foreign minister of Japan later that year. I'm also interested in looking at international exchanges, which could be in person or increasingly indirect, as we're all more familiar during the COVID period. A lot of these exchanges are now happening virtually. In the past, we can think of them also happening in formats like exchange of letters or telephone calls, for example. I also look at international examples, which could be particular studies of different economies and the structure of those economies, or the structure of particular companies in the case of state-owned enterprises. And I look a little bit less in this project, but also recognize the importance of diaspora networks, especially in the case of China, for sharing of ideas across international borders, as well as joint projects between governments. So we can think of, for example, the Baoshan steel plant developed between China and Japan as a good example of this type of joint project, where there's a lot of exchange happening actually at the working level through having this project together. So how then do we go from all of this transnational engagement to actually affecting domestic policy outcomes? And so identify, again, a menu of different mechanisms by which this might occur. So first and most obviously would be firsthand experience through direct observation or in-person exchanges, which may take place in China or abroad in the context of study tours. That's the Chinese term that you see there. And when people come back from these exchanges within the government bureaucracy, they will do formal reporting, either oral or written. They may also have more informal private communications with higher level leaders. And there's also highly formal presentations at government convened meetings of officials and enterprise representatives. And these may either involve international policy ideas and practices, or in some cases, they may actually be international actors who participate in them. And then finally, there also are some written materials. Studies might be written of the American economy or the economy of Singapore or Japanese enterprises, and then circulated internally. And also officials who engage in this exchange. And I do say officials, these are primarily either state officials or researchers who have some type of affiliation with the state, for example, through a think tank in China. And so they might deliver these talks outside the state bureaucracy to targeted public audiences, and they may also write for those audiences as well. And so I want to illustrate this concept of policy collaging over a period of time by looking in depth at this case of the restructuring of Chinese state-owned enterprises and how China's enterprise policy and these firms evolved over the course of several decades. And so what I want to do here is to call attention to the role of different countries, policy ideas and practices at different stages of evolution. Now, I'm not arguing that at any given point, China was only looking at any particular country, but just to try to make this not be too chaotic and confusing, I focus at different periods of time on the main examples and main international ideas and practices that China was drawing upon during this process. So I want to start back in the 1950s with the nationalization of industry. And so here, very unsurprising, when we think about policy collaging, China was very much focused on studying and adapting and incorporating policy ideas and practices from the Soviet Union. So in the case of state-owned enterprises, for example, we have the first 5-year plan. And one of the key aspects of the first 5-year plan is the joint state management of private enterprises as the prelude to full nationalization, which was officially declared complete in 1956, although of course we know that was a process that took a little bit longer than that. And again, coming back to this policy collaging concept, we can really see this emphasis on selective incorporation even back then. And so here we have Xi Zhongxun, who is then the Central Committee member responsible for managing Soviet experts in the 1950s. And he said, foreign experts can only help us. Relying on the thinking of foreign experts is dangerous. So here we have this sense that China has to be quite selective in terms of engaging and incorporating these international policy ideas and practices, even cautious, we could say. Now in the 1960s, even during a period on the eve of the Cultural Revolution, when we might think that China was most close to engaging international examples, we see actually that policymakers were still looking at international examples, and not only the Soviet Union, but also the United States and European countries. And we see this for the state-owned enterprises and China's enterprise policies in the context of experimentation with corporate trusts. And so I found this really interesting material in my research published in 1964 by the National Economic Commission, and then one of the key economic policy making bodies in China. And we have people like Bo Weibo and Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi supporting the conducting of studies of foreign companies like General Motors. And so here we have a book that is looking quite closely at the experiences of these capitalist firms to see what China could learn for state-owned enterprises and its own enterprise policies and the experimentation of corporate trusts. Now, obviously, this experiment didn't go very far. In fact, the involvement of some of the individuals I just mentioned with this process of experimentation actually became cited in the political persecution against them, as engaging with these capitalist international examples. So then as we shift to the late 1970s and 1990s for enterprise policy and SOEs, we see increasing emphasis on the formation of enterprise groups. And this is coming very strongly from China's engagement with Japan during this period. And so we see this, the China study tour delegation in 1978. There were very many study tour delegations to Japan during this period. This one you see a picture of in 1978. They actually stayed for a month. And then we see also the creation in 1982 of the China-Japan Economic Knowledge Exchange Conference. Here's a picture from 1985. This became a highly institutionalized international exchange mechanism between those two countries that continues up to the current day. And so through this engagement with Japan and these different mechanisms, China had some key takeaways for its enterprise policy and SOEs. And to summarize two of them here, the first is that asset consolidation could aid economic performance by creating economies of scale, and it could also increase the efficiency and lower the costs and boost the speed of technological upgrading and thereby China's ability to catch up economically. And from Japan, China also got this idea of enterprise groups as an organizational solution to the dilemmas of state ownership, and namely, how do we keep state control by increasing while at the same time increasing competition. And so in a state-owned enterprise or in an enterprise group, which is, you could think of it shaped like a pyramid, the state is keeping the ownership at the top, but there's still a lot of competition that's happening among the different member enterprises. And then some of those member enterprises can be publicly listed in order to access capital markets, but we still are keeping at the top that state ownership and control. So then as we move to the late 1990s and the 2000s, here we see the creation of shareholding enterprises. Japan, again, especially in this early period, remaining an important example for China. Here you can see a book on the left by a senior economist. And so here you can see this book on the left focus on Japanese shareholding enterprises and China's enterprise reform. And then also on the right here, I want to call attention to the role of the United States as well as the international financial, and I should also add legal community here. This is a picture of Sinopec, which was the first of the large industrial Chinese state-owned enterprises to have an overseas public listing with a triple IPO in New York, London, and Hong Kong. And very key in this process of restructuring Sinopec and helping prepare it for the overseas public listing was the US law firm Sherman and Sterling. And so this was actually the part of the project that I was really hoping to go deeply on during the Wilson Center Fellowship. And I was hoping to go to New York and also Hong Kong and try to find some more people to interview who had participated in this process. But unfortunately, that did not happen. But if there is anyone out there who participated in this process, I would really like to connect with you. Okay, so moving now to the 1990s, we have the development of centrally controlled as state-owned enterprises. And so this is really looking primarily at the largest industrial state-owned enterprises that are owned and controlled by China's central government. Of course, there's a number of state-owned enterprises that are owned by lower levels of government as well. And here we see China engaging quite deeply with the example of Singapore. And we see this influence clearly in the design of a state holding company, the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, or SASC for short, which was established in 2003 as a special commission of the State Council. And it drew directly from some study that Chinese policymakers had done of the government holding company Temasek in Singapore. And there's also been a number of routine exchanges between these two bodies. Here you see a picture of this annual directors forum that has gone on for nearly 2 decades between them. And there's also routine leadership visits between these two organizations as well. So in my talk today, I focused primarily on the case study of Chinese state-owned enterprises, but certainly I think that this process of policy collaging is something that we see in other policy areas in China, as well as beyond China. So to give just several examples of this, one example is the household registration system or the hukou system in China. Of course, we know that this system evolved early in the PRC through close engagement with practices in the Soviet Union, as well as in more recent times, evolving through the study of point-based international immigration systems in Canada and also in Hong Kong. And we see this also in policy collaging, also in the context of corporate governance and China's company law. We see supervisory boards borrowed from Germany, a system of independent directors that draws from the United States, the United Kingdom. And looking beyond China, I give just one example here of Japanese criminal justice system reform. We see a mixed approach there with both professional judges and lay participation. And this was adopted after sending study tours from Japan to the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany. So to wrap up with some key takeaways from this project so far, what I really want to call attention to is the fact that transnational engagement routinely occurs outside the context of international organizations and transnational advocacy networks. And of course, that's not going to be news for many people listening to today's panel, but I do think that there is a tendency, even in the context of US-China relations, to focus very much at these more established forums and at the very, very top level exchanges. The second point I want to leave you with is the idea that these policy collages that result may yield points of congruence, but not fundamental convergence. And so if we look, for example, at the case of corporate governance that I just mentioned in China, we might see some aspects of corporate governance in China that appear to be similar to practices in the United States or in Germany or in the UK, but they may actually function quite differently. And so I think that if we recognize this, that it will help us to establish more realistic expectations about the extent to which this engagement or any type of points of commonality that result may actually ultimately take us toward fundamental convergence. I think this is quite unlikely. And in fact, it's not the point. When you make a collage, you're not trying to copy a picture that is already there. You're trying to create a new one by engaging creatively with elements of many different pictures. And finally, I want us to, again, refocus the conversation on domestic actors. So a lot of looking at policy diffusion in the context, at least of political science, focuses on the socialization of Chinese actors in international organizations, for example. But what I think is maybe more important to look at is the extent to which domestic actors really do still have a lot of their own agency to choose which examples they engage with, to shape the form and function of the transnational engagement with different countries and policy ideas and practices from those countries. And finally, to affect the ultimate consequences for domestic policy. So I'll end there, and thank you very much for your time and attention, and I welcome any questions and comments in the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Wendy. Again, for our audience, if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, you have 2 ways of doing that. You can tag @AsiaProgram on Twitter, or you can send an email to asia@wilsoncenter.org. We'd like to hear from you. Well, I have quite a few questions. Before getting into them, perhaps steering things off in strange directions, I'd like to invite the 2 experts to make any comments about each other's work that they might have, or if there are any questions that arose from the presentations, please, Xiao and Wendy, anything that you would like to ask each other?
Yeah, I can start with asking Wendy a question. Thanks, Wendy, for a really fascinating talk. I really enjoying your presentation. It's really interesting. And I'm particularly fascinated with those informal channel, informal networks of international advisors. That's so fascinating to think about how this informal kind of like informal consultation happens. So I'm wondering if we can make some more comments or give us some details about the actors and the agents that are active in this space. Who are they, and what kind of actions they usually take like in this space.
Thank you very much, Xiao. So the question is about some of these more informal channels and the different contexts in which they might occur. So given that I'm focusing on Chinese policymakers, I recognize that there's a certain bias in my research to focus on actors who are either state actors, government actors, or are in some way affiliated with the government, for example, by working at a Chinese think tank that has association either formally or in terms of presenting information and research to the government as part of the policymaking process. And so these informal channels, a lot of them, they may begin with these international exchanges that are occurring in person and then be continuing on after that as relationships are established. So let me give you a specific example, again, from the past. So in 1985, there was the Bashan-Lund Conference, which was facilitated by the World Bank, bringing international economists to China and to spend, I believe it was 2 weeks together, taking a riverboat tour. And so here we can see the involvement of a number of different actors. So there was the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which helped to arrange this exchange. And then we have the World Bank externally helping to identify some of these international experts and support them coming to China. And so we have here, we could call it, is it informal or is it formal? I mean, sometimes the line is a bit blurred between the two, but what we can see is after all of these actors came together in that more in-person, formal setting, they then continued their correspondence informally through letters for decades, up until this time. So for example, Janos Kornai and Wu Jinglian, one of the senior economists in China, they have continued to be exchanging letters, including on the occasion of their 90th birthdays in recent times. And so what might begin in these more formal settings, these interactions can then lead to informal channels of communication. And I don't want to say influence, but certainly information sharing and possible adaptation and incorporation of those international policy ideas and practices into domestic Chinese policymaking. So if I could also ask a question
please.
For your work, Xiao, given my interest, I was really excited to hear you talking about China's legal professionals following global trends in data governance and then incorporating some of what they observed in their own domestic litigation efforts. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more, and maybe a similar question about the process of this type of transnational engagement. How is this actually happening? And to what extent you feel that what they are observing beyond China is actually able to be adapted and applied to be useful within the Chinese context? Because you talk about the social space around data governance primarily as a domestic one, but as your presentation went on, I started to think of it more and more as an international or even transnational space.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Definitely. So I think there are kind of like, domestic actors, domestic driving forces for this, data protection, for the advocates of data protection. But at the same time, they're also following closely the global trends of global data policies. For example, some of them data right groups, they are following closely, what is going on, and they have been translating and disseminating the global data policies from the Europe, from North American, also from India, Singapore, and other places, basically all around the world into Chinese, and disseminate that content through social media and other news outlets. So And talking about the making of PIPL, the Personal Information Protection Law, it actually goes through a very long process. The very first draft is provided by experts. It's called expert version. Those experts, data policy and legal professional experts, they actually studied closely the existing conventions of global data policies. So that's not surprising for us to see, the PIPL actually resembled a lot GDPR when it was unveiled in October. Right? So I guess, we do have a lot of resonance in our, projects here. We see, this kind of transnational flows through, formal and informal channels through the process of translation. And by the way, a lot of this translation of these legal texts and data policies were actually conducted by college university students. So they're actually very active in following these trends and doing this translation job. I think this is what, to a certain extent, you can call this as kind of translation activism, to borrow a term from the media scholar Guobing Yang. So I think this is, very interesting, realm that actually happens, that connects the domestic realm and the international realm. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We do have an anonymous audience question. I think this one is for you, Xiao. What is the sentiment on protection of personal data from government use or collection? Have you seen mechanisms enacted that would limit the use or collection of data by the government? Or have the legal and other actions been focused on the protection of data against misuse by private enterprise? And if I could sort of add a very closely related question, Americans have read a lot about the rollout of a Chinese social credit scoring system. And at least as it's been reported in the United States, it sounds like the Chinese government has access to a great deal of personal information. And so is there anything, how does that, the audience member question, how does that relate to social credit scoring and this question about, government use of personal data as opposed to private enterprise or private individuals?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a really good question. So I think PIPL is a comprehensive data protection law. It applies to all data controllers, which includes both the government entities and business entities. In fact, if you take a look at PIPL, that's a special section, specifies the government use of personal information. So, but also there are, as in GDPR, there are also kind of specific, groundings on the legal processing of data, which includes the processing of personal information for public security reasons and public health and instances concerns public interest. So I think what's really the question here, I think the question here behind the concern about government access to data, to personal information, is really about the question of the surveillance. I think that's really a good concern, because we think about the question whether the government or the law enforcement really have backdoor access to data, to personal information, to encrypt data. This is really a controversial issue, not only in China, but also in US. We often see, the battle, and I think elsewhere as well, we often see the battle or even like the bargaining and negotiation between governments and big tech companies. However, what is missing from the scenario, from the picture, is the voice of the user, right? So that actually creates a lot of distrust of the user towards the government and also towards the tech companies. I think this is especially an issue, especially a concern after the Snowden incident. But from another perspective, I think this fear of surveillance also indicates that the governance data shouldn't really be left to just the government or several big tech companies. The users should really have a voice. You know, should be an important stakeholder on the table. So that's my answer to the question. And besides, just one small point to add about the social credit system. I think the question here is also related. I think what's really interesting is that the social credit system has been discussed a lot in different contexts. But it seems to me not so much details has been revealed about how it actually works. I recently encountered a study which published in Critical Asian Studies. The author conducted a kind of like extensive field study in several cities in China. So the conclusion she got from the study is that the social credit system is actually a very fragmentary system, and local government, including the officials, actually had no idea what to do with the system, and they have no idea how to implement the system, where and how should it be implemented. I think and back to the question, I think the major concern here is actually the surveillance of the power of the government and the fear of this kind of like issue that extend to a broad range of society, a broad range of social realms, and then eventually it is about the voice, about the power of the users, which should be really we should really be foregrounded in this conversation. Thank you.
You mentioned that the PIPL, before it was promulgated, had been put out for a period of public commentary. And this is done with a lot of Chinese laws. And sometimes there's such a big public outcry or so much public interest that they really do have to go back to the drawing board, as happened a few years ago with the new marriage law, proposed marriage law. Can you tell us what kinds of issues came up in this period of public comment? Was this something that Chinese citizens were very interested in? Did they sort of yeah, and ignore it? And if they were concerned, what were the concerns that were raised in the public comment period?
Yeah, I think the public comments are actually very active. I followed some of the conversation there. A lot of law firms and also local think tanks, also universities, they all organize all kinds of workshops and forums to discuss the draft of PIPL. I think if I got it correctly, the draft actually received more than 1,000 comments by the end of the comment period. So, and also there are a few letters from the common citizens directly addressed to the legislative department. So some of the issues I think is mostly concerned with the specific details about the implementation of the law. For example, in the PIPL, besides the broad consent mechanism, the law also introduced a very specific consent mechanism that required specific consent from the data subject concerning sensitive personal information. So, but in the law itself is kind of like a guideline, very broad guideline. People are concerned, people have the question, how exactly these rules are going to be implemented. So a lot of our question about the specific implementation details of these regulations. And also there are also some experts raised the question about the section about the government's use of personal data, whether they can provide more specific guidelines or more specific explanation about how this is going to be implemented. So I guess most of the questions, most of the comments focus on the details and how for example which department, which government department is going to have the power to enforce this law. So that's what I gathered. Yeah.
But one more follow-up question, and then we have some for Wendy, because I know that you're interested in the social and cultural aspects of these questions. So what can you tell us about the current state of debate about privacy, surveillance, management of data issues, these governance issues is in China now? Is it a settled question? Are people simply going to get accustomed to it and take the convenience of commerce? Are they more or less taking their guidance from the government? Or is there an active evolving discourse about the relationship of data to individuals, to corporations, to government? How big a cultural foment is there in China now? And to what degree is there a sort of acceptance or acquiescence? What can you tell us?
Yeah, so I think, what's really interesting is that personal information actually become really hyperactive space in China. All parts have something to say about personal data protection. Of course, from the instance I presented here, you can see Chinese Chinese common citizens, especially those legal professionals who are quite informed legal professionals, they are quite active in promoting the personal information protection. At the same time, I think there is another branch of argument even among the data protection, data policy professionals, is trying to understand what is the good balance between personal rights protection and technology innovation and industrial developments. So among the Chinese data professionals, they have this perception that, basically understand there are two approaches to data protection. One is represented by the EU approach, which is more based on basic fundamental human rights. And the other approach is more US approach, which some of the Chinese data professionals understand more industry, pro-industry and more pro-innovation. So some of the data professionals, they are trying to make an argument that the data protection should be balanced with the should not prevent industrial development and innovations. Of course, we hear this kind of argument all the time. So it is kind of like ongoing debates in China, and so that's kind of like general picture.
Okay, thank you. Wendy, you've given us a number of very good reminders, I think are very timely given the current Washington discourse about SOEs. And I think you asked us to imagine an SOE. What's the first thing that comes to mind? And I think that probably for many of us, it's not just the backwardness and the heavy industrial sorts of images that you showed us, but the notion of SOEs as isolated citadels, somewhere deep in the heartland of China with ribbon wire around them. And you've made the point that, in fact, they've always been vectors for the transmission of international expertise to China. From the beginning, they have not been isolated. They have not been citadels. They've been involved in Chinese policy, and they've been involved in the world. And I think it's also very useful that you point out that much of this involvement has been within Asia. The United States has not necessarily been the primary place that they've gone to for expertise. We see Japan, Singapore, Europe, and the dialogue in Washington is mostly that SOEs exist only to steal American intellectual property, and that's what they're primarily about. And so that complication is that you've provided, that more complex narrative, is very welcome. Two questions, both of which are really Washington concerns, the sorts of critiques of SOEs that we hear about now. You've described this transnational activity as an exchange, but it's not quite a parallel exchange, is it? As in so much of our exchange relationship with China over the past 40 years, China, from these transnational activities, they tend to get very concrete information that they seek to increase their own material, technological well-being, to enhance their own power. And the Americans in this exchange, if anything, get more sinological insights into what China is interested and what China is building toward. So there isn't parallelism there. Looking back over this, what you call policy collaging, this attainment of expertise and information for China, many people in Washington now say that that was a mistake. That was us enhancing Chinese capabilities and building its comprehensive state power to the detriment of the United States. How do you feel about that SOE's role within that narrative? You know, were we snookered by trips to China and these little sort of goodies that they passed out? Or is there a different narrative that you would want to put forward?
Well, thank you very much for this question. It raises the crucial issue of power hierarchies. And of course, in talking about policy collaging, I'm making a conscious effort to emphasize domestic agency of actors within China. So the artists in my policy collaging metaphor are those Chinese policymakers.
Right.
And so I'm trying to recenter, I think in a similar way to Xiao is really looking at the domestic actors and their agency in these processes. Now, that said, I would be very naive to assume that this was any type of an equal exchange, particularly during some of the earlier periods of development that you mentioned. And so, you know, I'm quite idealistic. I do want to believe that every exchange is two-way. And so, you know, both sides are getting something out of it. But I remember I asked this question when I did interviews in Japan in 2019. And I asked it of someone who had participated in these exchanges with China. And he thought for a long time. And finally, what he came up with was, you know, we learned that socialism doesn't work. Yeah. So in terms
we get insights into China, but not into the industry, right?
Yes. So, you know, at this time, I think the power hierarchy was very much one where, yes, China was getting more of that concrete information, and it wasn't in the more powerful position when it came to these exchanges. Now, I guess I would push back, you know, a little bit on the idea that in these exchanges, American actors, for example, didn't benefit. So Sherman and Sterling, I'm sure they have done, you know, quite well, other US law firms, by working with these Chinese firms. I mean, these are commercial relationships. And so maybe not in terms of policy, what they were getting, they were certainly benefiting in other ways. And so these exchanges have been, I think, productive, although we could debate, you know, specifically how and who had the more powerful position. Now, something I didn't mention in my talk, which is quite relevant to the point you raised, is how the power hierarchy has shifted today. Now, obviously, we're in a very different place. And so in the end of my report for the Wilson Center, I write about some cases where China itself is now the subject of the policy collaging by other countries, you know, as a successful example that others would like to study. And so I talk, for example, about Justin Yifu Lin, who is serving in a capacity as an international economic advisor to countries in Africa, including Ethiopia, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Senegal. And so I think the power dynamics are quite fluid. They've obviously evolved over time. And now China is not only engaging in policy collaging, but itself is now the subject of policy collaging for others to try to come and get that concrete, actionable information.
So yes, and this brings us to the question, which is the title of this panel, Global Norms and Governance. As Chinese SOEs become the vehicles for Chinese investment, and in some cases, the transmission of standards, especially through things like infrastructure lending and what China calls the Belt and Road, how open is China to what you call policy collaging by other countries? If a Chinese bank or a Chinese SOE is to get a contract for an airport or a high-speed rail system, are other countries allowed to say, you know what, China, we love the tech, we'll collage the tech from you, but we're going to take our labor rights standards from Europe and we're going to take environmental protection standards from the United States? Or does China, through the SOEs and its lending activities, want the whole kit and caboodle, the whole Chinese model to be taken as one, which some people would say is the export of something like a Chinese model or Chinese systems? Are they open to other nations picking and choosing those aspects of Chinese SOEs, capabilities, or expertise that they like, and rejecting other aspects, for example, non-transparency?
So again, I think this comes back to the question of power hierarchies, right? So yeah. We have to look at the terms that domestic actors are able to negotiate. And here I basically mean national governments, which remain the largest sources of financing for the types of infrastructure projects that you're talking about for the Belt and Road. So a lot of it really depends on the terms that they are able to negotiate for themselves. And this depends in turn on their power relationship, or we could talk about it a number of different ways, right? Like their dependency on China or their overall indebtedness. And we see different patterns emerging in different regions depending on those types of relationships. So just to give you an example, when we look at Chinese companies operating in Latin America, there is a much lower percentage in numbers of Chinese workers who are involved in those projects compared to Africa. And in part, this is due to strong unions in Latin America. And so I think that's a good example of how domestic actors, given their different positions, are able to negotiate for quite different outcomes that have very real implications for those projects and communities and environments on the ground. Coming back to the other question you mentioned about, to what extent China is open to others borrowing different elements,
and rejecting elements mostly.
And rejecting elements. I mean, this is my own personal opinion, but I think that they're quite open to that, and they're not necessarily trying to impose particular practices or ideas. And in part, this is due simply to the nature of those commercial relationships. So the vast majority of the early projects in the Belt and Road, and even today, are contracts. So after the project is built, the company packs up and goes home. It doesn't have a long-term role in the operations or the profitability, or how that project might affect the local government and environment, just by nature of their role in the project as a contractor. And so where I think this is really going to change, and it will become quite interesting, is this ongoing shift where the companies are taking these long-term commercial stakes in the project they build, and they are financing them and they are operating them. And it really does depend for them, quite importantly, how they perform commercially or what the effects are for local communities and environments. And so I think in the past, it's been much more of a flexible kind of open approach and not imposing, in part due to that particular nature of the role that the companies are playing in those international markets. But we're already seeing a shift underway.
Going back to the SOEs as domestic actors, is collaging, what you call collaging, is this slowing down or has it ended? We read a lot about the growing wealth, self-certainty, the confidence of Chinese corporations as they become national champions and increasingly international champions. Do we still see as much of that kind of openness, borrowing, adaptation going on, or is that era behind us?
This is a great question about the extent to which we still see the policy collaging. I do agree with you that the pace and scope of policy collaging has become less in the current times. And in part, that's exactly for the reason that you mentioned. Of course, China still very much wants to keep improving these companies in a variety of different ways, but they also feel, based on a combination of political as well as economic logic, that these companies are doing relatively well. And certainly the companies, state-owned enterprises, played a very important role in China's response to crises like COVID-19. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's more motivation for policy collaging in an area that is new, where there's not a lot of previous experience or capacity or knowledge, or where there's been failures or there's a lot of uncertainty. And we have less of that now for China's state-owned enterprises.
Xiao Lu, I wonder if I could come back to you. And I know that you were looking primarily at domestic issues of personal information and governance in the digital space. But of course, these are transnational issues. We have, as you know, many people in the United States and around the world who use WeChat, who use TikTok, who get most of their information in some cases from these Chinese-owned, in some cases managed, in some cases censored platforms. And so increasingly, and not just in the digital realm, China's standards for treating its own citizens end up becoming standards or models for China's treatment of citizens around the rest of the world. Is there anything, knowing as you do both the American environment and the Chinese environment, do you have any concerns about the spread of China's platforms, but also China's standards and the way that it construes freedom of speech, the relations between individuals and communities and sovereign nation states and corporations. Do you have any concerns about that as Chinese platforms spread internationally and in the United States in particular? Is there anything you think we need to keep an eye on?
That's a really big issue and also complicated issue. What I feel here is that we should really look into the question how we define China model here or Chinese model here, because I think it is kind of like, large question, what we call Chinese model. Again, I think the question here is really complicated because we think about the data governance or this data issue, data regulation here, actually concerns a variety of actors and social agents here. Even like, in terms of like relation between technical platform and the state, it can be complicated. So in that sense, I think, that's why I think it is actually important to look into the, subnational agents or subnational actors here, which Wendy also mentioned in her project here. Because sometimes if we put too much emphasis on the national level actors, we actually sometimes get kind of really reductive picture, what Chinese model is or what Chinese model of action is, right? So I think that's kind of like, first question I would raise here is to actually think about different levels of actors there and how we define the complexity of a Chinese model here, and think about the very complicated negotiation and bargaining and also competition of interest even within that space there. So that's the first issue I raised here. And then, of course, the data question is also really international issue, because we know data flows all the time across borders. So the data localization and the extraterritorial application of data regulation increasingly becomes a concern in the international relations here. So we see data localization becomes kind of like more and more kind of like routines implemented in different places around the world. What do we see in China's data localization requirement here is also I see also it's kind of a policy collaging here, to borrow Wendy's word. They, on one hand, they try to require certain kind of like data localization policy. At the same time, they also open an additional channel, which is the additional channel for the agreement, data transfer agreement with foreign entities. So, which is kind of like, quite routine practice among other countries, right? So I think, what is interesting here is that the data localization and the cross-border data flows increasing become kind of like contexting area. So I see this is actually an area of promising or area of interest to international community. So this can be an area for more conversation and collaboration in the future. Yeah. Thank you.
I'd like to give each of you a chance to make any final comments you would like to our audience, especially as it relates to how the United States should view these issues, the power of the SOEs, these power hierarchies, or these digital issues here in Washington. You're very familiar with the largely negative narratives in Washington, on the Hill especially, about US-China relations and about American corporate involvement with China of all sorts. Anything that could possibly increase China's capabilities, China's wealth, China's technological well-being is now in some ways suspect. So is there anything you would like, I guess, Wendy and then Xiao, just in conclusion, thoughts to leave our audience with?
Thank you so much. So, coming back to that issue of power hierarchies, that you raised, I think when the U.S. engages with China on the issue of state-owned enterprises, clearly we're in a very different a power hierarchy than the last time these issues were really substantively engaged, at least in the realm of trade, when China was negotiating to join the World Trade Organization. And so, a lot of the issues that have been raised by the US with regard to the state-owned enterprises are much more intractable and difficult to address now, because they go beyond simply state subsidies to particular firms, but it's really the state-led model of economic development in which Chinese SOEs are playing a major role. But it's very difficult to have the leverage to try to make these changes now compared to 20 years ago. And I don't mean to say it was easy 20 years ago, certainly not, but I think we're in a very different position of leverage when the US engages China on those issues. And so I think it's important to establish more realistic expectations for what is likely to occur in the future. And there were a lot of high expectations for how state-owned enterprises were going to evolve in a more market-oriented direction after the 2013 third plenum, talking about a decisive role for the market and resource allocation. And then these hopes were more or less dashed several years later. And so I think having more realistic expectations about the degree to which transnational engagement is actually going to lead to influence in the case of China is very important. And also with policy collaging, there's a tendency in the US to focus very narrowly on the bilateral relationship, but of course, China is at the same time engaging actors all over the world with regard to these different policy areas. And so I think if we don't transnationalize our perspective a little bit, it's easy to lose track of that. And then the last point I would make with regard to the state-owned enterprises is, again, related to this issue of expectations and what's going to happen. A lot of it is predicated on approaching these firms with an economic logic, just as we might in the US, looking at the performance of firms here, be really focused on their financial performance and their return on assets. But these indicators, while they're important in China, there's also a political logic that's very much at play in terms of how the government thinks about these firms. And so there's an expectation that there's going to be a lot of change just by looking at the economic measures. But I think we need to also appreciate the importance of the political logic and the political functions that these firms are playing. And that helps us also to establish more realistic expectations about the degree to which they're likely to fundamentally continue to change in the future.
Thank you, Xiao Liu. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, thanks very much. This is really inspiring conversation. And I think one thing I think really interesting is the priority or increasing importance of technology governance that not only China is faced with, but US and many other countries faced with. I think this conversation about the risk of technology such as AI and big data analysis, this kind of conversation is happening around the world. And recently we see a lot of conversation, increased conversation about the inclusion and diversity issue in relation to technology, and also, of course, surveillance issue related to technology as well. So I think, in both China, I think through my study, I think in China, in the social space of technology governance in China, there's kind of like, very active forces, driving forces to promote the more equal and more fair use of personal data. So I think this is really a promising realm. And also it tells a lot about the governance of this technology should really rely on multi-stakeholder approach, which really bring different stakeholders onto the table to discussion the governance for this technology and to mitigate the risk of this technology. And the most important one, I think, is the users and different group of users, diverse different group of users, especially those minorities, especially those less privileged groups. So I think that's kind of like, areas of challenging, but also areas of promising collaboration and conversation. So I think that's the main message that I get from my research. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Xiao Liu of McGill University and Wendy Leutert of the University of Indiana, both for your comments today and for the work, the research, and the writing that you have done as Carnegie China Fellows here at the Wilson Center. We're very glad that you and all of your colleagues are able to join us these 2 days, and only wish we could do it in person. I hope everybody will join us tomorrow for the second set of panels at 10 o'clock, China's foreign policy along a contested periphery. At 12:30, the Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese influence in the global South. And then last, tomorrow afternoon at 2:30, is a new Cold War inevitable? Chinese intentions and the role of misperception. We hope you will be with us again tomorrow to continue the conversation. Again, thank you to our fellows, and thanks to everybody else for joining us. Good afternoon.